And if you are called on during Q&A, please stand, make sure to speak into the microphone, and state your name and affiliation before asking your question. Thank you so much.
Everyone, it's a pleasure to see you all here on a lovely Friday in Washington, finally. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to the Council on Foreign Relations Reza Pahlavi. This meeting is on the record, so the usual council rules actually don't apply. Reza Pahlavi and I will engage in a conversation between the two of us for about a half an hour, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And I just want to say that when I was a sixth grader writing an essay about the Iranian hostage crisis, I never imagined I would be sitting here with a fellow resident of Potomac, Maryland, talking about Iranian politics. Well, welcome to the council once again. Let's start out in the late 1970s. Iranians rose up and overthrew the regime that your father led. Why would they now choose to restore the monarchy? And what is your vision for Iran?
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here in this prestigious gathering. I know the Council on Foreign Relations and their work over the years. I think I've had 2 or 3 occasions prior to participate in some meetings in the early 80s and then later on. So I'm glad to be one more time amidst this group. Look, I don't think this is about restoration or about a particular outcome. It's about democracy and self-determination. And I think whatever Iranians thought back then, if you listen to what the Gen Z of Iran says today about that generation, is what the hell were you thinking? And you put us in this mess, so how are we going to liberate ourselves now from what has been the net result? So I think today the viewpoint and the vision of Iranians who, by the way, have become more than ever aspiring to something that is in fact, a very unifying theme, which is a sense of national identity against a regime that from the very beginning tried to crush every aspect of Iranian culture, history, from celebrating Nowruz all the way to other things. In other words, an Iranian renaissance against the most anti-Iranian regime we've ever seen. Not to mention the fact that it's been extremely repressive, and I don't think there's anybody in this room which would deny the fact that perhaps this is the most sinister regime we have encountered in modern history, that encompasses the worst of all the evil regimes we have witnessed. Totalitarian in one way, like the Soviet Union was, fascist in a way, like the Third Reich and the Hitler regime was, racist in the sense that the apartheid regime in South Africa was, and yet it's still sitting there, imprisoning the Iranian people on the one hand and threatening the stability of the world, including being a threat to this country's interests and national security. So long story, what is the perspective in Iran now? And why am I here? And what is my role? My role is not to run for office. I'm not. My role, however, is to maximize the chance for my fellow compatriots to be able to liberate themselves and decide ultimately via the ballot box and ultimately via referendum what it is that I ultimately would like to have as a secular democratic government to replace this religious dictatorship. This is all our campaign, and this has been our struggle all these years. And we hope to be able to know that in this campaign we're not alone, and we would have the support and the solidarity of democracies that are of the same viewpoints and values that we cherish, unlike a regime that stands totally against them. And that's what the fight is all about. Values of liberty, equality, human rights, versus a regime that has stampled on it from the very beginning. And that's the cause that we are all fighting today.
Let me follow up on that for a second, because I think you made a little bit of news in that statement. If the Iranian regime were to fall, however it does, you would not necessarily put yourself forward to lead the new regime. As a democracy, you would be among candidates, or you wouldn't be a candidate at all.
Again, it's not being a candidate for the job of ruling. I've offered the role of leading this campaign of transition. Why? Because this is the ask of the majority of my fellow compatriots who have a trust in me to be able to play that role for them. So my job is to unify as much as possible the democratic opposition. My job is to bring as much support as possible to the people themselves. My job is also to mobilize as much as possible the diaspora. And this is based on a 5-point plan that I have initiated, at least in the last couple of years, which includes maximum pressure on the regime, which is something that the world is doing. Snapback is being re-implemented. That's one aspect of what external pressure could be. Maximum support to the people, meaning that parallel to a campaign of maximum pressure, there has to be an element of maximum support, assuming we want to go beyond appeasement. And this time, seriously consider that an end of this regime is ultimately the solution, but it's done at the hand of the Iranian people, not by means of foreign intervention or anything like that. So you need to be able to actually have an element of more direct support to the people, be able to also, as a consequence, encourage maximum defections from regime elements to the people, to minimize the cost of change to the Iranian people, and have a better chance of a smoother transition post-regime collapse than any other scenarios. And ultimately, in parallel to all of this, a plan of Iran prosperity and reconstruction, which is an IPP project that I've also launched about 2 years ago. So the combination of all of these is part and components of what we have done over the last at least 2 years. And I guess the question that everybody might have is, okay, we've seen several uprisings in Iran, at least in the last 5 years, the last one being the Mahsa Amini murder that triggered the Women Life Freedom movement. And why is it that until now we haven't really seen the ultimate uprising of people? And the simple answer is, well, this is an extremely repressive regime. And instead of restricting the regime in its abilities, it has in fact been emboldened by means of the wrong policies or approach, especially in the Western world, again, appeasement, again, the release of funds that they should not have had access to, that did not serve in the sense of helping the starving nation in Iran, but fortifying the proxies, arming them, equipping them. I would say that October 7th was not a coincidence, but all of this ties into what we can do to equal the playing field for the Iranian people. So this time they have an actual chance, should they commit to an ultimate campaign of uprising, not to be crushed yet again by a very repressive regime. And this is why we need to be able to work with the free world, those countries that understand the dynamics of change via civil disobedience and domestic uprising, as opposed to by means of war or foreign intervention or occupation, because that's not the direction we want to go at all. And that's why I say the change of regime in Iran is a very different scenario than what we've experienced in recent years, since 9/11, what happened in Afghanistan or Iraq or anything else.
How do you've invoked the Iranian people and the Iranian diaspora, I want to get to that in a minute, but you've invoked the Iranian people any number of times. How do you, as a leader of this movement, and have put yourself forward to lead a transition, if not the country, how do you gauge the strength of the opposition to Iran, especially after the so-called 12-day war? It's hard for me to call it 12-day war, it just seems weird. But how, after that, there's been this wave of repression in Iran. So how do you know, sitting here, how strong the opposition is, and how do you know that they can be successful? I guess what I'm asking is, if you think it's strong, how do you think this is going to actually happen?
Well, information certainly gets to us. I mean, there are ways of circumventing the regime's attempt to curtail the ability of people to communicate. Social media has a big role to play in this, but also other challenges that are more safe for certain elements that would be in a position of giving us critical intel on what's happening on the grounds inside Iran, both on the domestic side, I mean the civilian side, as well as the military and paramilitary forces. As a matter of fact, when I announced in a press conference in Paris, I don't exactly know how many months ago it was, but it was within this calendar year. That's where I announced a campaign where we will announce a QR code that people from inside who wish to cooperate or to defect from the regime can connect with us and share with us their information. And in the first few weeks, we had over 60,000 people who applied. I don't know what the number is now. It's probably greater than that. Information, of course, that needs to be vetted and analyzed to make sure that these are actually legitimate people, that we are not being infiltrated or penetrated by double agents. But that's very telling because these are people who would be in the military, in the paramilitary, in the civilian bureaucracy. And the reason it's important is because the whole point of my strategy in this campaign of putting an end to this regime cannot not have a factor of maximum inclusion of elements that can survive regime change. And my default position has been anyone whose hand is not soiled with the blood of the Iranian people should have a possibility of seeing a place for themselves post-regime collapse. We don't want de-Baathification. We don't want that mess. And of course, the Iranian people have the right to seek justice. And they will have their day in court, and those responsible will have to account for their crime. But majority of these people who are not part of this top echelon of the regime that benefits from these arrangements, it's a mafia that's just sucking the blood out of the Iran and its resources. Once they're out, those are the people who stand to face the music. Would they rather stand with a sinking ship, or do they think that this is the moment now to join with the resistance and the movement of liberation? And we are providing them an option so they are not in no man's land. That also depends on how the world responds to this phenomenon, because you cannot, on the one hand, ask people to defect and for people to rise if the world is still trying to negotiate yet another deal with this regime or push back or postpone this opportunity. And this window is open right in front of us right now, but it won't last forever. So we have to start calculating whether there needs to be a policy reset from a 4 decades long collective policy of the Western world, America and its European allies included, that has been mostly containment and appeasement, or we need to move to the next level now, because I think this regime has given far more chances to come clean, and they haven't. And how long do we want to kick the can down the road and say, not under my watch? This is really what we're facing right now.
I'm kind of digging the way history is rhyming here. We've gone from cassette tapes in the 70s to QR codes in the first quarter of the 21st century. I was going to ask you about the Iranian diaspora, but you mentioned something a couple of times about Western appeasement. So it's fair to say that you are opposed to a new nuclear agreement should one materialize, or should there be negotiations for a new nuclear agreement?
Well, first, I don't see one coming, and I think we are past that point, because the regime right now is so brittle and so vulnerable that as a last resort, I don't think they will cave in. In fact, they might double down, and they have done that in the past. What leads us to believe that this time they say, mea culpa, now we're going to be good guys? They had ample opportunities to do that. They were offered far better deals than the last offer they had received. We can rewind tape all the way back to the days of Khatami, and they still didn't take it. But the question should be, why didn't take it? It's because the DNA and nature of this regime is such that they cannot coexist in the same sphere of rationality of the world as we know it. Their entire existence depends on exporting this ideology. That was the entire purpose from day one. Khomeini, who then was championed as the person who would liberate Iran by those who led that campaign against the previous regime, could not have imagined what the consequences would be. But if he only had listened to a simple answer that he gave in an interview to a journalist as he was flying back in that 747 Air France Boeing to Tehran, and he was asked after 15 years in exile, what is your feeling returning to Iran? You know what he answered? Nothing. That set the tone of what Khomeini or this Islamic revolution was all about. It was not even about Islam. Because if you ask Iranian clerics today who are not part of the regime, never in our history has that particular faith been so damaged and people turning out from the faith. Right now in Iran, the largest, fastest growing religion is Christianity. We have over 1,500 underground churches in Iran. You all remember, talking about your article, that back then the first exodus of Iranians that were forced to exile were people who were immediately persecuted by the regime because they were Jewish or they were Baha'is and what have you. And yet they came to this country, many of them run this country, but they're dreaming of an opportunity to be able to help Iran again. And how good that would be for Iranians and how good it would be for this country. What stands between that future is this regime that continues to take hostages, that continues to fund whenever they can elements to bring more instability in the region. Bottom line, they are the ultimate problem. The Iranian people know that. Many people in the world are beginning to recognize that. The question is there the political will to do something about it? And that's the part that I'm afraid to say I have seen so far missing. I'm not saying it's going to remain like this all the time, but there needs to be a clearer process of making decisions. And I always remember two eras in history that marked and defined the world as we know it. One was during the Second World War, when you had Roosevelt and you had Churchill. And that combination ultimately put an end to the Third Reich. The second time around was Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They were able to bring an end to the Soviet Union. And of course, Gorbachev had a role to play in that, agreed. Today, the question is, we are faced with a situation where this very same Iranian regime that the British government tried to appease is stealing drone technology by sending students in British universities to transfer it back to Iran to serve the Russians in their campaign against the Ukraine, just on that front. What would be the prospect of a world where the whole region might be yet again dominated by another kind of superpower that does it in a different way? And I'm talking about China, obviously. Or for that matter, what happens right now in the symbiosis between the Iranian regime and Moscow when it comes to the Ukraine conflict. All of that being a situation where no Western leader has yet to identify the problem and the head of the snake. And so we are trying to appease the biggest culprit that is a reason for all of this instability. And I don't understand at the end of the day what's the rationale behind that formulation of foreign policy. I asked David Cameron when I was in London 2 months ago, why is it that you're not subscribing the IRGC as a terrorist organization? And his answer was, well, our basic thinking and the Foreign Office is we don't want to use our channel of diplomacy, which is our embassy in Tehran. Really? Didn't you use Switzerland as an interim or the Qataris for another reason? Do you really are telling me that you're afraid of subscribing the IRGC just because you don't want to lose a diplomatic channel with the Tehran regime? Come on. But that's one of the problems, among others. Anyway, I don't want to go.
I started out the question about nuclear negotiations. Would a post-Islamic republic pursue nuclear technology, recognizing that much of the infrastructure is not workable at the moment, but there are still Iranian nuclear scientists. Yeah. There is know-how. I'm sure there are sites that the United States and Israel did not find. Would it pursue nuclear?
You know, from the very beginning, it just didn't make any sense for me to consider Iran as a country that would be in a situation to actually have nuclear reactors for a number of reasons.
But didn't your father start the program?
Well, I will explain. But let me. Okay, we'll go back. Yes, in the 60s, when we were starting to look at other sources to provide electricity and not use fuel only as a source for generation of electricity, you know, thinking more of the byproducts in petrochemicals and what have you. At the time, we started looking at different options. There were gas turbines who were not efficient enough at the time and rather expensive. Solar energy, which was really its infancy, nothing to do what it could be today. And of course, nuclear. And we came to nuclear because ultimately it was more cost effective, which is why Iran signed the NPT. We had shares in Framatome, which was, I think, the entity that would have provided the nuclear rods for the two first reactors that were supposed to come online in Bushehr in 1982. And of course, in the middle of all this revolution happened. That was a calculation back then. But when I look at Iran on a seismic plate, very little water and access to water in low population area, it just doesn't lend itself to it. And I think today there are so many technologies in renewable energies, solar being one of them, that Iran is a perfect candidate for, that we can certainly bypass that nuclear aspect in 2025 as opposed to 1971 or 72. Anyway, that's my personal viewpoint. I leave it to the experts to assess that. I'm just sorry to see that billions and billions of dollars have been wasted on this program that has yet to generate in any practical way electricity. But something that is even worse is that as far as the nuclear ambition program of this regime, it has cost our country over $1 trillion worth of loss or damage. So the whole narrative is shifting towards let's be sane in mind, let's be concerned about environmental issues. And I've been spending a lot of time with Iranian entrepreneurs and American entrepreneurs, many of them in the fields of how can we best tackle this thing and Iran's energy needs and requirement. And more often than not, the nuclear issue doesn't even pop up, number one. Number two, I think that as far as the possibilities of having more impact in terms of Iran's economy, I think these other industries will provide much more immediate jobs for the country than any nuclear program would. But again, this is my personal opinion. So the future of Iran has to be on par with making sure that we are using the safest technologies, the ones that are most beneficial, and steer away from anything that could be subject to question. And we will operate in full transparency as we did before, unlike a regime that has never been transparent on the subject. And if you ask Grossi and the IAEA what's their take on the Iranian ambitions, they still won't be able to give you a clear answer. Reason more when you ask me about the nuclear negotiations. That's one of the issues. Can you actually trust them and what they tell you or what they commit to?
Let's go back to domestic politics in Iran. Your critics, my apologies, your critics, not me, they contend that, one, the Iranian opposition is terribly divided, and that the diaspora community is terribly divided, and that you've been unable to unite the diaspora community. So they question whether you'd be able to unite Iranians around a transition after the collapse of the Islamic Republic. How do you answer that question? What is the state of your movement, and how do you plan to unite Iranians who have very, very different views about a post-Islamic Republic Iran?
Well, for anybody who is interested in the facts rather than the narratives, I will point them to the facts. And the best fact that I can point them to when it comes to your question is last month when I was in Germany, we had the Munich conference, which was a conference that was the vastest and more diverse ever within the Iranian opposition in 46 years, including people from different walks of life, ideologies. Former Marxists and leftists were there, Republicans were there, representative of Iranian ethnic groups were there, representative of the latest wave of Iranian victims to the regime's repression during the Mahsa revolution, kids that were shot in the eye, their grieving mothers, they were all there. And it's on record for everybody to see. And the video is out there, you can go and study that. Yesterday, a new website was launched, which is the Iran Rising website. It was launched about 9 a.m. yesterday. As of 10:30 this morning, I asked one of my assistants what was the response. We had over 1.5 million views already in 24 hours. And people from inside Iran are putting their names out there to join this campaign and participate. If that's not an indication of unity and solidarity, I don't know what else I can put on the table as a proof to you people. So if you go and check that out, these are the facts, these are the measurables, and it's on that basis that I would say Iranians are becoming far more united. The opposition is getting more and more organized in working together on a common agenda. And the response from inside has been, of course, the strongest ever. And the interesting thing is that I announced this platform on the day of a national celebration of one of our cultural days, which is Mehregan, which is the celebration of light. And we have never had this particular celebration as vivid as others, like Nowruz, for instance, or Yalda, which are other national celebrated cultural holidays. For the first time in 46 years, Mehregan was at the widest possible scale celebrated in Iran. And that was also part of my call, let's do it on this day. I think that shows the connect, that shows the way people conglomerate, and how they respond to me and my appeal to them. And these are all the measurables. Now, of course, some people hate my guts and don't like my face. I can't do anything about that. But I think that if you were to take an opinion poll in Iran, and in fact there's a lot of data about that, surely a lot of people know that I'm, among anybody else, the most popular and the most trusted element, which is why they like to respond to me to be able to lead this movement for them.
Part of your narrative is that the Islamic Republic will come to an end. Now, forever is a long time, but it has demonstrated resilience that I think people did not expect. It's been under sanction for a very, very long time. This past summer, it took 12 days of pounding by the Israelis and then the United States. And the targets that the Israelis hit were not just nuclear infrastructure or ballistic missile production, but as we discussed, instruments of the regime's repression. Yet the regime seems to be stable and durable. Why should we expect anything other?
Well, first of all, you have a society that lives 60% of them under the poverty line. Let's not forget that in 1979, the rial was exchanged at 76 rials to the dollar. As of yesterday, it's 1,180,000 rials to the dollar for the same nation with the same amount of oil and gas in its reserves. Then this is before snapback kicks in. I don't see in what way that could be tenable for a starving nation on the one hand, and for the regime not to have access to this kind of revenue, and how the hell they're going to survive and maintain their war machine going on. It's just a matter of time. In that sense, it is vulnerable. I'm as curious as you are to see the effects of snapback and what would that bring into the issue. And I think it's also the further isolation of Iran, because if you look at what may happen as a result of whether or not Hamas will accept the deal or not, then I think that this will be a time to see to what extent internationally the regime is also more than ever isolated and curtailed. These are the actual dynamics in front of us. One is domestic, one is on the international scene. And I think we can, on that basis, say that if whatever until now has helped the regime somehow manage to survive, but at the end it will fall. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And the real issue is, and I remember the end of the Cold War, not many nations, particularly in the West, were prepared for the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The mindset was the Berlin Wall might be around in our lifetime. That's what I thought, by the way, and yet it fell. But were we prepared for the aftermath? This is one of those cases that I urge a lot of you to say, regardless of the status quo, you have to factor in that there could be a change. And if that change were to occur, are we prepared for it? Not to fall in the same problems in the post-Soviet Union collapse. That was not necessarily anticipated. This time we can anticipate. And in fact, this is the answer to a lot of people who keep saying, we don't know what's going to be happening after the regime collapse. Is it going to be more chaos? Is it going to be more instability? Blah, 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 blah. And I think that we have enough data and actual measurable resources, both at home and abroad, to prove to you that Iran is not a country where you would face a vacuum or civilian strife. Iran is not Afghanistan. Iran is not Iraq. It has its own dynamics, its own polity, its own civil society, although heavily repressed, but certainly alive and well. And I think it is that element that can provide you that what you're investing this time on is not a change of behavior by a regime that you cannot trust at the end of the day, but liberate a nation that see eye to eye on the same visions and principles and can be an actual partner over there. America by itself cannot and will not be able to maintain global stability without having some partner in that case. Yes, the Abraham Accord was a good start. Clearly it was sabotaged by this regime for obvious reasons. And I've been saying this, and I said this when I was in Tel Aviv 2 years ago in a press conference, that if we elevate the Abraham Accords to the Cyrus Accords, meaning that a different Iran that is committed to regional peace and cordial relationship with our neighbors will be the element that will seal the deal and allow for that process to take place. So we don't have to worry about the relationship between Tehran and Jerusalem and Riyadh and all the other countries in the region. On the contrary, we create an environment that is conducive to maintaining even more stability and encourage economic development, everything that our country needs. And it cannot happen so long as this regime is there. And the regime knows that. It's just trying to buy time. Its ultimate tactic has always been buy time, hoping that there won't be a Trump in the White House or there won't be somebody that will be more aggressive as opposed to appeasing. That's what they've been doing as a tactic. And I think the Iranian people see through it, and I hope people outside the world begin to see through it as well.
Thank you. Well, we have exhausted my questions that I planned to ask. So